The wind howled across the dry plains of the American frontier. Dust swirled in the air, and the sun beat down on a land that refused to be tamed. In the middle of it all rode a man whose name would echo through time, Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp. He wasn't born a hero. He wasn't even born tough. But in the chaos of the Wild West, where law was a whisper and death was a rumor, Wyatt Earp would become both legend and mystery, the last man standing in an age of violence, vengeance, and survival. Wyatt Earp was born on March 19, 1848, in a small town called Monmouth, Illinois. His father, Nicholas Earp, was a strict man, a farmer, a soldier, and a dreamer who always believed that the next piece of land would bring fortune. His mother, Virginia, was patient, quiet, and strong, the calm that balanced her husband's storms. But Wyatt was different. Even as a boy, he felt the pull of the unknown, that endless urge to see what lay beyond the next hill. When Wyatt was just a teenager, the Earp family packed up their belongings in a wagon and set out west. They traveled through mud, rain, and endless prairies, chasing the promise of a better life. The West was new, wild, and full of opportunity, but also full of danger. Bandits, disease, and drought followed settlers everywhere they went. It was a world where only the toughest survived, and Wyatt Earp learned early that if he wanted to live, he'd have to become tougher than the world around him. Wyatt's childhood was full of movement. Illinois, Iowa, California, back to the Midwest again. The Earps never stayed in one place long. Every time Wyatt thought he had a home, it was time to leave again. But something was growing inside him, a hunger for purpose. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Wyatt was just 13 years old. His older brothers enlisted to fight for the Union, and Wyatt wanted to join them more than anything. He even tried to run away from home to enlist, but his father caught him and dragged him back. "Your time will come," Nicholas told him. Wyatt never forgot those words. By the time he turned 21, Wyatt was done drifting. He wanted to do something that mattered. He found work as a lawman in Wichita, Kansas, a booming cow town filled with saloons, gamblers, and troublemakers. Wichita was the kind of place where a man's courage was tested daily. Drunk cowboys shot up bars. Thieves roamed the streets. Law meant nothing unless a man was willing to enforce it. And Wyatt? He was willing. He wasn't fast with a gun, not yet. But he had something even more powerful, self-control. While others shouted and panicked, Wyatt stayed calm. He didn't shoot first. He thought first. And that made him dangerous in a different way, because calm men don't miss. He quickly earned respect as a deputy. People in town began to whisper his name. "Don't mess with Earp," they'd say. "He doesn't scare easy." But the thing about the frontier was that peace never lasted long. One bad night, Wyatt got caught up in a fight that turned ugly. The details were messy. A bar brawl, a disagreement. Some accusations that he'd broken the law he swore to uphold. Rather than stay and defend himself, Wyatt did what he always did best. He moved on. He drifted from town to town, working odd jobs. Buffalo hunter, gambler, sometimes lawman again. He crossed paths with dangerous men, sharpshooters, and outlaws who'd become legends themselves. One of them was Bat Masterson, another fearless lawman and gambler who'd become Wyatt's lifelong friend. Together, they worked in Dodge City, Kansas, a place nicknamed the wickedest little city in America. If Wichita was wild, Dodge City was madness. Gunfights broke out every weekend. Saloons lined the dusty streets. Cowboys spent their wages on whiskey and cards, and in the middle of it all stood Wyatt Earp, the quiet deputy with cold eyes and a steady hand. In Dodge City, Wyatt became known as one of the best peacekeepers in the West. He didn't drink much. He didn't talk much. But when trouble came, he faced it head on. People feared him. Not because he was cruel, but because he was unshakable. He had one rule: no one's above the law. And he lived by it, even when that law meant standing alone. But under the calm, Wyatt carried scars no one could see. He'd lost people. He'd seen friends die in the street. And deep down, he knew that as long as he stayed in these towns, death would keep coming for him. In 1879, Wyatt Earp decided to leave Dodge City. He was tired of fighting drunks and chasing bandits for pennies. He had heard stories of a place called Tombstone in the Arizona territory, in a silver boom town where fortunes were being made overnight. So Wyatt packed up, said goodbye to the blood and dust of Dodge, and headed southwest with his brothers Virgil and Morgan. They weren't just chasing money. They were chasing peace, a chance to start over, maybe even to build a life free from violence. But the frontier has a cruel sense of humor. The moment the Earps arrived in Tombstone, they stepped into the middle of a war between lawmen and outlaws, between order and chaos, and before it was over, Wyatt Earp's name would be written in blood and legend. He didn't know it yet. But everything that had come before, the long rides, the lonely nights, the battles in Kansas, had been preparing him for what was coming, because in Tombstone, Wyatt Earp would face his greatest test. He would draw his gun not just for justice, but for survival, and the story that would make him immortal, the gunfight at the OK Corral, was waiting just around the corner. This was not the story of a hero. This was the story of a man who lived by his own rules, and outlasted everyone else. When Wyatt Earp first saw Tombstone, Arizona, it didn't look like much. Just a scatter of wooden shacks and tents across a valley of dust. But under that dirt lay silver, and silver meant money, power, and trouble. Wyatt came with his brothers, Virgil, Morgan, and James Earp, along with their wives and friends. They weren't lawmen this time. They came to start fresh, to make money legally for once. Wyatt was tired of fighting drunks and chasing outlaws. He wanted peace, or at least a version of it. Tombstone was booming. Miners were flooding in from every direction, chasing silver dreams. Saloons opened on every corner. Gambling halls lit up the night. Gunshots echoed in the distance. The town was rich, wild, and on the edge of chaos. Exactly the kind of place that could make or break a man. At first, the Earps kept to themselves. Wyatt worked in gambling and real estate. Virgil, always drawn to order, accepted a job as deputy U.S. Marshal. Morgan helped him when needed. They weren't looking for trouble, but in a town like Tombstone, trouble always found you. Across town were the Cowboys, a loose group of ranchers and rustlers led by Ike Clanton, Tom McClory, and Billy Clanton. They were feared and hated by most law-abiding citizens. The Cowboys smuggled cattle from Mexico, robbed stagecoaches, and killed without hesitation. They saw themselves as free men, answerable to no one. And they saw the Earps as something worse than enemies, outsiders trying to control them. At first, the tension was quiet, an exchange of insults, a few threats whispered in saloons. But each month, the line between law and crime blurred a little more. Wyatt, with his calm eyes and silent strength, became a symbol of the law. And the Cowboys, wild and proud, refused to bow to it. One night, Wyatt met a man who would change his story forever, Doc Holliday. A gambler, a drinker, and a killer with a quick hand and a cough that never stopped. He was dying of tuberculosis, but he lived every day like it might be his last. Wyatt and Doc were opposites, one calm and steady, the other fiery and reckless. But they understood each other instantly. They were both outcasts in a world that didn't forgive weakness. Wyatt once said, "There's no friendship like the one born in danger." Doc Holliday became his shadow, his brother in arms. The months went by, and Tombstone grew louder, richer, and meaner. Every week there was another shooting, another body in the street. The Cowboys swaggered through town, drunk and armed, daring anyone to stop them. Virgil Earp tried to keep peace, but he was outnumbered. Wyatt watched the town slipping away. The same chaos he had seen in Dodge and Wichita creeping back into his life. Then came the stagecoach robbery that changed everything. Masked riders held up a coach, killing the driver and guard. Witnesses claimed to recognize the voices of Ike Clanton's men. Virgil swore to bring them in. Wyatt stood beside him. From that moment, there was no going back. The Cowboys swore revenge. The Earps swore justice. And Tombstone, that little town built on silver, began to prepare for war. One afternoon, Wyatt walked the dusty main street, his boots crunching in silence. The townspeople watched him pass. Some whispered that he was the only man who could stand against the Cowboys. Others said he was no better than them, that Earp justice came from the barrel of a gun. Wyatt didn't care what they said. He had seen enough of the West to know one truth. If you let fear rule a town, you lose it forever. Doc Holliday joined the Earps full-time. He played poker at night and backed them by day. Behind his cough and charm was a deadly temper. When someone insulted Wyatt in a saloon, Doc stepped in without hesitation. He'd draw faster than lightning, and though his hands sometimes trembled, his aim never failed. The cowboys, fueled by pride and whiskey, started calling out the Earps by name. Ike Clanton was the loudest of them all, always threatening, always drunk, always dangerous. He'd walk the streets shouting that he'd kill Wyatt Earp before the month was over. Wyatt didn't answer his threats. He never did. He just watched, waited, and prepared. He knew the West too well. Men who shouted the loudest often fell the fastest. But deep down, he also knew that one day, the shouting would stop, and the shooting would begin. As autumn arrived in 1881, Tombstone's tension was ready to explode. The town was divided. Those who stood with the law and those who stood with the cowboys. Even the streets felt nervous. The people walked faster. The bars stayed open later. Everyone could feel it coming, a storm made of pride, anger, and gunpowder. On the night before the gunfight, Ike Clanton got drunk and started yelling again, threatening to kill every Earp he saw. Wyatt ignored him until the morning when Ike stumbled through the streets, armed and loud. Virgil and Morgan arrested him and took his guns. But humiliation burns hotter than whiskey. By noon, Ike's friends had come into town. Tom and Frank McClory, Billy Clanton, and Billy Claiborne. They gathered near a small lot behind a photography studio, a narrow strip of land behind the OK Corral. The Earps heard about it. They strapped on their guns and walked slowly toward the lot. Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and Doc Holliday, 4 men walking through the dust heading into history. Each knew what was waiting. Each knew not all of them would walk away, and as they turned the corner, the air went silent. The crowd backed away. Hands tightened on revolvers, and for one long second, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The gunfight at the OK Corral was about to begin. The air in Tombstone was still that morning, too still. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Even the horses seemed nervous, shifting in their stalls, picking up the tension that had settled over the town like dust. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon on October 26, 1881, 4 men began walking down Fremont Street. Wyatt Earp, his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, and their friend, Doc Holliday, pale and coughing, his eyes sharp as a knife's edge. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every one of them knew what was waiting. At the end of that walk stood the Clantons and the McClorys, armed, angry, and ready to kill. As they walked, people peered out from saloon doors and windows. Mothers pulled their children inside. Bartenders froze mid-pour. Everyone in Tombstone had heard the threats, the shouting, the promise of blood. No one expected it would really come to this, but in the West, pride and fear were a dangerous mix. And when men carried guns, one word too many could start a war. Virgil Earp was the senior officer, the deputy U.S. Marshal. He carried a shotgun in one hand and a look of iron in his eyes. He had tried everything to avoid this. Now there was no choice. Wyatt walked beside him, calm as ever. He wasn't there to start a fight. He was there to finish one. They turned the corner near Fremont Street, and there they were, Ike Clanton, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, Billy Clanton, and Billy Claiborne. The cowboys stood near a narrow alley behind the OK Corral, pistols at their sides, horses restless beside them. They were angry, half-drunk, and humiliated. Ike Clanton had been disarmed that morning, beaten, and laughed at in public. Now his friends were here to restore his pride, with bullets. Virgil called out first, his voice echoing across the dusty street. "I want your guns, boys. Throw up your hands. We want to disarm you," Frank McClory sneered. "I've got as much right to carry a gun as you." There was a heartbeat of silence. One final moment when maybe, just maybe, no one had to die. Then someone's hand twitched. No one knows who fired first, but when the first shot cracked, all hell broke loose. Gunfire exploded in every direction. The sound of bullets shattered the stillness of Tombstone. Smoke filled the air. Horses screamed. People ran for cover. In less than 30 seconds, 30 shots were fired. Virgil was hit in the leg. Morgan took a bullet in the shoulder. Doc Holliday, wild and fearless, aimed his shotgun and fired at Tom McClory. Tom fell instantly, dead before he hit the ground. Wyatt moved forward through the chaos, steady and silent. He didn't duck. He didn't flinch. Witnesses said he looked like a man walking through rain. He aimed and fired at Frank McClory, hitting him square in the belly. Frank stumbled back, clutching his stomach, and tried to raise his gun again. Wyatt didn't hesitate. Another shot rang out, and Frank collapsed into the dust. Billy Clanton kept fighting, bleeding from the chest but refusing to fall. He fired again and again, shouting that he wasn't finished. Then, finally, he dropped to his knees, the gun slipping from his hand. When the smoke cleared, it was over. 3 men lay dead: Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton. Ike Clanton had fled the moment the shooting started. Billy Claiborne ran too. Virgil and Morgan were wounded. Doc Holliday was coughing blood but still standing. And Wyatt Earp, the man at the center of it all, hadn't been touched. Not a single scratch. Some said it was luck. Others said it was destiny. Wyatt never said a word about it. When the gunfire stopped, silence returned, heavy, eerie, and unreal. The townspeople came out slowly, their faces pale, their hearts pounding. The street smelled of gunpowder and blood. Bodies were carried away. The Earps turned and walked back up Fremont Street, smoke still rising behind them. No one spoke. They had survived, but something in each of them had died that day. By nightfall, the news had spread across the territory. Some called the Earps heroes, brave lawmen who had defended order in a lawless town. Others called them murderers, men who abused their badges and gunned down their rivals in cold blood. There was no middle ground. The newspapers feasted on the story. The gunfight at the OK Corral became a sensation. Reporters twisted the facts, adding drama where none was needed. But for Wyatt Earp, it wasn't a legend. It was survival, and survival always comes with a price. That night, Wyatt sat in silence, cleaning his gun. The sound of the metal clicking echoed through the room. Doc Holliday lay on the bed, coughing, a half-empty whiskey bottle by his side. "You know," Doc said between coughs, "people are going to talk about this for 100 years." Wyatt looked up, his expression unreadable. "Then they'll be wasting their breath," he said quietly. "Because they'll never know what really happened." Doc smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but legends never care about the truth." Wyatt didn't answer. He just stared at the lamp's flickering flame, thinking not of glory, but of the next sunrise, and whether he'd live to see it. The next day, a judge ordered an inquest. The Earps were charged with murder. Witnesses lied. Cowboys shouted for vengeance. But after weeks of hearings, the judge ruled in their favor. The Earps had acted within the law, defending themselves as peace officers. Legally, they were cleared. Morally, the town stayed divided, and as Wyatt walked out of that courtroom, the world saw him differently. Some saw him as justice itself, others as the devil with a badge. Wyatt Earp didn't care. He had done what he had to do, but fate wasn't finished with him, because the real tragedy was yet to come. After the gunfight, Tombstone was never the same. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, drifting through the alleys like a ghost that refused to leave. People spoke in whispers. Some called the Earps heroes, others called them killers. But everyone knew the blood wasn't done being spilled. Wyatt Earp tried to move on. He told himself the shooting was behind him, that justice had been served. He helped his wounded brothers recover. Virgil's arm would never be the same. Morgan's shoulder still burned when the nights grew cold. Doc Holliday coughed harder each morning, hiding blood in his handkerchief so the others wouldn't see. Tombstone had grown quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hides hate beneath the floorboards. The cowboys were broken but not gone. Ike Clanton swore revenge. He told anyone who'd listen that he'd kill every Earp before the year was out. Wyatt ignored him. He wanted to believe the fight was over. He even started talking about leaving, maybe heading north, starting fresh again. But fate doesn't let men like Wyatt Earp walk away so easily. One cold evening in December, Virgil Earp was crossing Allen Street when shots erupted from the shadows. Bullets shattered glass and wood. One tore through Virgil's left arm, mangling it beyond repair. Somehow he survived, but his badge hung heavier than ever. Wyatt was furious. He walked into the nearest saloon, slammed his revolver on the table, and said, "No more warnings. No more chances." His eyes were cold, steady, and dead quiet. Everyone in that room knew what was coming. He gathered men he trusted, Morgan, Doc Holliday, and a few others who'd stand with him no matter the cost. They patrolled the streets, watching, waiting. But revenge is patient. It hides until the moment hurts the most. 3 months later, on a Saturday night in March 1882, Wyatt and Morgan were at the billiard hall playing pool. Laughter filled the room. For a moment it almost felt like peace. Wyatt chalked his cue. Morgan lined up a shot. Then from outside came the flash of a rifle. The sound was deafening. The window shattered. Morgan dropped instantly. The ball rolled across the table and stopped beside his hand. Wyatt fell to his knees, shouting his brother's name, but it was no use. Morgan Earp died before he hit the floor. The men who pulled the trigger vanished into the dark. Wyatt carried his brother's body home in silence. Josie wept. Virgil sat pale and broken, his useless arm cradled against his chest. Doc Holliday poured whiskey but couldn't drink it. The air inside the room was thick with grief and rage. That night, Wyatt changed forever. He had spent his life believing in law, believing that justice could be measured by truth and trial. But standing over Morgan's coffin, he realized that the law had no teeth left. It would never punish the men who murdered his brother. So Wyatt decided to do it himself. He pinned on his badge one last time, not for duty, but for vengeance. The next morning he gathered a posse: Doc Holliday, Texas Jack Vermillion, Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, and a few others hardened by loss. They called it the Vendetta Ride. They rode out of Tombstone before sunrise, dust swirling behind them like smoke from a burning past. Their first target was Frank Stillwell, a cowboy suspected of ambushing Morgan. They found him at the Tucson train station, crouched behind a rail car, pistol in hand. Wyatt didn't hesitate. 2 shots echoed through the night. When the smoke cleared, Stillwell lay dead on the tracks. News of the killing spread fast. The newspapers called it frontier justice. The authorities called it murder. Wyatt called it fair trade. The posse rode on, hunting down the men on their list one by one in the desert's endless silence. Each time they found a suspect, gunfire followed. The vendetta burned like wildfire through Arizona. Wyatt was no longer the calm deputy from Dodge City. He was a man haunted by ghosts. He rarely spoke. He barely slept. His face had hardened into something people feared even more than his gun. Doc Holliday stayed close. Between coughs, he joked, tried to lighten the weight. But even Doc could see the darkness settling in his friend's eyes. "You can't kill your way to peace, Wyatt," he said softly one night beside the campfire. Wyatt stared into the flames. "Maybe not," he answered, "but I can make sure they never kill again." The vendetta lasted weeks. By April, several cowboys were dead or scattered. The rest fled the territory. The Earps had become both heroes and outlaws, hunted by the law they once served. Finally, the posse disbanded. Doc headed east, his sickness worsening. Wyatt rode north, following whispers of new gold strikes, new towns, new beginnings. But there was no victory waiting, only silence. Morgan was gone. Virgil was crippled. Doc was dying. The legend of Wyatt Earp had been born in blood, but the man behind it was tired, lonely, and empty. He never spoke of the Vendetta Ride again. When asked years later if he regretted it, he simply said, "Regrets for people who had a choice." Tombstone faded behind him, swallowed by dust and memory. The town he tried to save had nearly destroyed him, and as he rode west into the setting sun, the wind carried a whisper through the canyons, a whisper of the man who became both lawman and outlaw. Hero and hunter, Wyatt Earp had drawn his final line, and this time no one dared to cross it. The dust of the Arizona desert still clung to Wyatt Earp's boots when he finally stopped riding. The vengeance was over, but the emptiness stayed. The men he'd hunted were gone, dead or scattered, but victory brought no peace. The wide plains looked the same as ever, yet the world felt hollow. He camped under a cold sky, staring into the fire. Each crack of the burning wood sounded like gunfire from another life. Doc Holliday sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket, coughing softly into the night. Neither spoke much anymore. There was nothing left to say. Wyatt had crossed a line he could never uncross. He was no longer just a lawman. He was something harder to define. A man carrying both justice and guilt on his shoulders. When the sun rose, the posse broke apart. The men shook hands quietly, each heading in a different direction. Wyatt rode west, his horse slow and tired. Doc turned east, looking for a place where his lungs might last another winter. Their eyes met one last time, and in that silence was a friendship forged in fire. Wyatt never saw Doc Holliday again. Doc would die a year later in a Colorado hotel room, far from the sound of gunfire, staring at the ceiling with a faint smile. The man who'd lived every day like it was his last finally ran out of days. Wyatt rode on, through Nevada, through California, through the broken edges of mining towns that rose and fell like tides. He gambled, ran saloons, chased gold and silver dreams that never quite paid out. For a time he drifted through the boomtown of San Diego, where fortunes were made overnight and lost by dawn. He was older now, slower, but still carried that quiet confidence, the look of a man you didn't want to cross. People recognized him sometimes. They'd whisper, "That's Wyatt Earp, the man from Tombstone." Some wanted to buy him drinks. Others wanted to test their luck. Wyatt never talked about the Corral. When someone asked, he'd shrug and change the subject. To him, it was no legend, just another day he survived. Years passed. The Wild West began to fade. Towns grew into cities, railroads replaced horses, and the frontier that once made Wyatt Earp famous turned into history. He kept moving, chasing work wherever he could find it. In Alaska, he ran a saloon during the gold rush. In Nevada, he tried his hand at mining again. But every new town felt smaller than the last, every adventure shorter, every friendship thinner. By the time he settled in Los Angeles, the old gunslinger was an old man. The year was near the turn of the century. Cars rattled through the streets. Electric lights burned where once only oil lamps had glowed. Wyatt Earp had outlived almost everyone who ever drew a gun on him. He was the last of his kind, the last lawman of the old world. He lived quietly with Josephine Marcus, the woman who had followed him since Tombstone. She was proud, fiery, and protective of Wyatt's name. They never had children, but they had each other. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset over California hills. To the neighbors, he was just an aging gentleman with sharp eyes and a slow stride. But sometimes younger men would come knocking, reporters, writers, and later filmmakers. They'd heard the stories and wanted to hear them from the man himself. Wyatt always told them little. He said the truth wasn't half as exciting as the stories people made up. Yet slowly, the myth grew. Books and newspapers turned him into a legend. They called him the greatest lawman of the frontier, the man who cleaned up Dodge and conquered Tombstone. Wyatt never argued. He just listened and nodded, letting the world believe what it wanted. He spent his last years visiting Hollywood sets, advising young directors on how gunfighters really stood, how they drew, how they faced death. One of those young men was John Ford, who would later create the Western films that shaped the world's imagination. Another was Tom Mix, the cowboy star who idolized Earp. They called him Mr. Earp and treated him like living history. Sometimes, while watching actors stage their shootouts, Wyatt would smile faintly. He knew real gunfights were nothing like the movies, shorter, uglier, and quieter. There was no music, no speeches, just smoke and silence afterward. He rarely spoke of regret. But once to a friend he said softly, "If I had it to do over again, I'd rather be known for something else." The man who had lived by the gun had grown tired of its echo. On a cold morning in January 1929, Wyatt Earp passed away in his small Los Angeles bungalow. He was 80 years old. No children, no fortune, no badges left to wear, only a story. Josephine sat beside him, holding his hand as the light faded from his eyes. When news spread, the world barely noticed. The newspapers printed short obituaries. Few remembered the lawman from the old days, but those who did spoke his name with a mix of awe and fear. The last survivor of the Corral was gone. Later that year, Tom Mix led the funeral procession. Behind him walked movie stars, old lawmen, and silent men who'd known Wyatt in his prime. They buried him in a simple grave without fanfare. The man was gone, but the legend had just begun. Over the decades that followed, writers and filmmakers turned Wyatt Earp into something larger than life, a symbol of courage, justice, and the price a man pays to stand his ground. But beneath every story, behind every myth, there was still the real Wyatt Earp, the quiet man from Illinois who spent his life chasing peace and finding only dust. And somewhere out there, in the wind that sweeps through empty desert towns, you can still almost hear his boots on the boards, slow and steady, the last echo of the Old West fading into memory. After Wyatt Earp died in 1929, the world hardly paused. There were no headlines shouting his name across the country. No parades, no medals, just a short note in a few California papers saying a former lawman of the old frontier had passed away. For a man who had outlived nearly every outlaw and lawman of his time, it was a quiet ending. Maybe too quiet. But legends never stay buried. The people who had known Wyatt, those who had heard him talk in saloons or seen him stroll through dusty towns, started sharing their stories again. Some remembered him as a brave marshal who faced chaos with calm eyes. Others swore he was cold, ruthless, even cruel. And somewhere between those stories, a myth began to rise. Josephine, his widow, became the keeper of his memory. She couldn't stand the thought of people painting Wyatt as a killer. To her, he was a hero, a man who fought for justice when no one else would. She guarded his story fiercely, correcting anyone who dared to tell it differently. But history has a way of slipping through fingers. Writers started coming around, asking questions, chasing details, hungry for the last taste of the Old West before it disappeared completely. In the 1930s, as America struggled through the Great Depression, the country needed heroes again. People wanted to believe in courage, honor, and justice. The cowboy became that symbol, and Wyatt Earp fit the mold perfectly. The first real book about him came out in 1931, just 2 years after his death. It was called Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, written by Stuart Lake. The book was more myth than fact, full of dramatic moments, heroic speeches, and impossible precision. But it didn't matter. America was ready to believe. Readers devoured the story. They saw Wyatt not as a man, but as the embodiment of order in a world of chaos. The book made him larger than life, a symbol of the law standing alone against the storm. From that point on, Wyatt Earp wasn't just history. He was legend, Hollywood noticed. The Western film industry was booming, and directors were desperate for real names from the old frontier. Wyatt Earp's name had weight. It had grit. It had mystery. The first movies based on his story appeared in the late 1930s and 1940s. Black and white tales of honor, courage, and gunfire. They weren't accurate, but they were powerful. The Earp of those films was a clean-cut hero who always did what was right, who never missed a shot, who never flinched. The real Wyatt Earp was far more complicated, but the audience didn't want complicated. They wanted a man who could stand tall when everything else fell apart. Soon, the myth grew bigger than the man himself. By the 1950s, television brought him into every American home. The life and legend of Wyatt Earp, starring Hugh O'Brian, turned him into a household name. Kids wore cowboy hats and practiced quick draws in their backyards. They didn't know about the blood, the doubt, or the grief that followed him. All they knew was that Wyatt Earp was the man who tamed the West. And maybe that's how legends survive, not through truth, but through what people need to believe. Still, not everyone accepted the shining version of his story. Historians began digging into the old records. They found witness statements, court documents, and letters that told a different tale, a messier, more human one. They wrote that Wyatt sometimes bent the law, gambled heavily, and even worked as a saloon keeper. For every book that praised him, another tried to tear him down. Some said he was a cold opportunist, chasing fame and fortune through violence. Others said he was simply a man shaped by his times, doing what he had to do to survive in a brutal world. Yet, no matter how many facts were uncovered, the legend refused to die. In the decades that followed, new generations rediscovered Wyatt Earp in their own way. John Ford's classic My Darling Clementine in 1946 turned him into a poetic hero. Then came Gunfight at the OK Corral in 1957. With Burt Lancaster wearing the badge, each film changed the story a little, polishing it, romanticizing it, until the myth gleamed like silver. By the 1990s, Hollywood gave him another life in Tombstone, with Kurt Russell's cold, determined eyes breathing fire into the role. The movie made a new generation feel the power of his story, the rage, the loyalty, the code that could not bend. And through every retelling, one truth remained. People are drawn to Wyatt Earp not because he was perfect, but because he stood for something bigger than himself. He represented the moment when law first met chaos and refused to back down. He was the line in the sand, the one who said, "No more." Even now, more than a century after the gunfight, his name still carries weight. Historians argue, writers rewrite, movies remake. But the man from Monmouth, Illinois, still stands tall in the American imagination. His legend has crossed oceans, appearing in novels, comics, and even video games. Around the world, Wyatt Earp remains the image of the Old West, the man who walked into danger and didn't flinch. Maybe that's what he always wanted. Not fame, but to be remembered. And in that, he succeeded. Because when the dust settles and the last campfire fades, people don't remember the details. They remember the feeling, and Wyatt Earp's story still feels like courage. For most people, Wyatt Earp is remembered for his gun. But the truth is, the weapon was never the center of his story. It was just the tool of a man who lived by something much more powerful: a code. In a world where laws were still being written and justice often came too late, Wyatt Earp built his own set of rules. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He had moments of pride, anger, and doubt. But through it all, he carried one belief that never changed. A man's word was his law. Out on the frontier, that was the only thing that truly mattered. No government, no sheriff, no court could protect you. The only thing you had was your name, and the respect it carried. People often misunderstood Wyatt because he was quiet. He didn't brag, he didn't shout. He simply did what needed to be done. He was the kind of man who walked into danger not because he wanted to, but because no one else would. When he was younger, Wyatt used to say, "Fast is fine, but accuracy is final." That line would follow him through life, in gunfights and in choices. He believed that thinking before acting, staying calm when everyone else panicked, was what separated a man from a fool. He saw too many men die because of pride. Too many who reached for their guns before they reached for reason. And maybe that's what made Wyatt Earp different. He wasn't just a lawman. He was a man who tried, in his own flawed way, to build order in a world that didn't want it. In Dodge City, when other deputies lost their tempers, Wyatt would stand still, eyes steady, voice low. He'd talk first, shoot last. He used his gun less than people think. But when he did, it meant something. In Tombstone, the code was tested. He followed the law, even when it broke his heart. After the Corral, when the town turned against him, Wyatt didn't lash out. He waited, he listened, he moved carefully, until the law failed him. Then, and only then, he turned to vengeance. Some called him ruthless for that. Others saw it for what it was, loyalty. Because to Wyatt Earp, justice and family were the same thing. You protect your own, always. He believed deeply in loyalty. To his brothers, to his friends, even to men like Doc Holliday, people society looked down on. He didn't care about a man's past. He cared about how he stood when things got hard. That loyalty, though, came at a price. It drove him to choices that cost him peace. It made him an outlaw in one town and a hero in another. It made him human. Over the years, as the legend grew, people started asking what kind of man Wyatt Earp really was. Was he good or bad? Hero or villain? The answer has always been both. He had a temper. He gambled heavily. He bent the rules when he thought justice demanded it. But beneath it all, there was a strange kind of honesty. The kind that comes from a man who doesn't pretend to be anything else. He never called himself a hero. He never claimed to be pure. He just did what he thought was right in the moment and lived with the consequences. That's why his story still matters today. Because the world changes, but the struggle doesn't. Every generation faces the same choice Wyatt did: to stand up when it's easier to walk away, to draw a line and hold it, even when it costs everything. He once told a young deputy, "Don't mistake quiet for weakness. The quiet ones are thinking about where they'll put the bullet." It wasn't about killing. It was about being deliberate, precise, controlled, in life as much as in battle. That was his true weapon. Not speed, not strength, discipline. He saw chaos all around him, greed, fear, violence, and he refused to let it take him down. That resistance, that stubborn calm, became his legend. And in some way, it's the part of Wyatt Earp that still speaks to people. Because everyone at some point stands at their own version of that dusty street, facing something that scares them, something they can't avoid. Most turn back. Wyatt didn't. He stood his ground. Not for fame, not for money, but because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. Maybe that's the real moral of Wyatt Earp's story. That being brave doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means you face it anyway. When people talk about the Old West, they talk about the guns, the saloons, the endless horizon. But the truth of the West wasn't in the noise. It was in the silence between gunshots. The moments where a man decided who he really was. Wyatt Earp decided to be the man who stood his ground, even when it broke his heart. He wasn't perfect, but he was steady. And in the wild, unstable world he lived in, that was enough to make him a legend. The code he lived by wasn't written anywhere. It was carried in his walk, his stare, his silence. It said, do right, stand tall, and never draw unless you mean it. That's why his name still echoes. Because in the end, it wasn't the gunfight that made Wyatt Earp unforgettable. It was the man who refused to run. Most people remember Wyatt Earp as the man who walked into gunfights and never flinched. They picture the hat, the coat, the cold eyes staring down danger. But the real Wyatt wasn't made of stone. He was made of silence, loss, and a longing that never left him. Behind every photograph, every headline, there was a man who wanted something simple, a place to belong. Wyatt was not born brave. He learned it the hard way. When he was young, he lost more than most men could bear. His first wife, Urilla, died of typhoid fever just months after their wedding. She was 21. Wyatt never spoke of her again. He left their town without saying goodbye to anyone, and for years afterward, he carried that grief like a hidden scar. That loss changed him. He became quieter, more distant. He learned to keep his feelings locked behind a calm face, the same calm that later made outlaws fear him. Wyatt drifted through life after that, never staying in one place long. He worked, fought, gambled, arrested men, and sometimes broke the law himself. He wasn't chasing adventure. He was running from pain. Then came Josephine Marcus, the woman who would stand beside him for almost 50 years. She was fiery, stubborn, and beautiful. Everything Wyatt wasn't. They met in Tombstone, in the chaos before the gunfight, and somehow found in each other a kind of balance. She saw something in him that no one else did, a tenderness hidden behind the silence. They weren't perfect together. They fought, sometimes bitterly. Josephine had a taste for luxury. Wyatt had a habit of losing money on bad bets. But through it all, they stayed side by side. When the world called him a murderer, she called him her husband. When the world forgot him, she remembered every detail. There was a time, years after Tombstone, when Wyatt tried to build a quiet life. He ran saloons, opened a horse stable, even prospected for gold in Alaska. He never found peace, but he kept searching for it, in the glow of a campfire, in the shuffle of poker cards, in the sound of wind over empty hills. He was never one to speak about his feelings. But people who knew him said that, sometimes, late at night, he'd take off his hat, stare into the distance, and whisper something only he could hear. Maybe it was her name. Maybe it was regret. He was loyal to his friends in a way that few men are. When Doc Holliday was dying in Colorado, Wyatt tried to visit, but he couldn't bear to see him wasting away. Doc sent a letter instead, writing, "I'm dying of my disease, Wyatt, but you're dying of your memories." And maybe that was true. The world moved on, but Wyatt never really left the past. He carried Tombstone with him wherever he went. The dust, the echoes, the ghosts of his brothers and friends. He never had children. Maybe that was by choice. Maybe he didn't want to bring anyone else into the world he'd seen. The violence, the revenge, the endless moving. It left no room for raising a family. Instead, he poured everything he had into surviving and into protecting Josephine. By the time they settled in Los Angeles, they were older, worn down by time. Josephine liked the city, the bright lights, the new world growing out of the desert. Wyatt didn't care for it. He missed the silence of the frontier. Sometimes young actors or filmmakers would visit, asking him about Tombstone. He'd smile politely and tell them just enough to keep the legend alive. But when they left, he'd sit quietly, lost in thought, knowing that they would never really understand what it cost him, because legends sound simple. Life never is. Wyatt wasn't fearless. He was careful. He wasn't cold. He was tired. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing peace. That's what most people get wrong about him. He didn't want to be remembered as the fastest gun in the West. He wanted to stop needing his gun at all. He had dreams once, of a ranch, maybe a family, maybe a son to carry his name. But those dreams stayed behind in the dust of Arizona. Buried with his brothers, as he grew old, he walked slower, talked less, but his eyes never lost that sharpness, the kind that made men lower their voices when he entered a room. Even in his 70s, people said Wyatt could make you feel like he knew what you were thinking before you said a word. But he didn't use that strength anymore. He saved it, held it, the way old gunslingers hold their last bullet, just in case. In his final years, Josephine tried to convince him to tell his story, to let the world see who he really was. He always said the same thing: the truth won't sell. He was right. When he died, the truth went with him. All that was left were the stories, the ones that made him a hero, a villain, and everything in between. But if you strip away the myths, the gunfights and the Hollywood lights, what remains is something far simpler and far more human. A man who loved deeply, lost often, and kept walking. A man who stood for what he believed in, even when it broke him. A man who carried his ghosts with dignity. And maybe that's what greatness really is. Not being unbreakable, but being brave enough to live with the cracks. Wyatt Earp was no saint, but he was real. And sometimes that's more than enough. By the time Wyatt Earp turned 70, the world he once knew was gone. The dusty trails had turned to paved streets. Steam trains gave way to cars that rattled and coughed through the growing cities. The West, his West, had vanished into history. He used to ride across endless plains where the horizon never ended. Now skyscrapers stood where the sun once fell on open fields. And sometimes, as he sat on his porch in Los Angeles, he'd stare at the streets and whisper, almost to himself, "It's all gone." Wyatt had outlived almost everyone, his brothers, his friends, even his enemies. Only Josephine remained. She tried to keep his spirits up, talking about the new century and the wonders it brought: airplanes, radio, electric lights. But Wyatt wasn't impressed. He'd seen men rise and fall too many times to be amazed by machines. Every now and then, someone would knock on his door: a journalist, a historian, a young writer chasing the ghosts of the old frontier. They'd come with notebooks, questions, and stars in their eyes. "Mr. Earp," they'd ask, "what was it really like?" "What happened that day at the OK Corral?" Wyatt would lean back in his chair, the lines on his face deepened by the years, and answer softly, "Son, it was 30 seconds of shooting and 30 years of talking about it." He'd say it with a small grin, then go quiet again, eyes distant, lost somewhere in the desert of memory. The truth was, the past never left him. He could still smell the gunpowder, still see the faces of the men he'd buried, still feel the weight of the badge on his chest, and the heavier weight of what it cost him. In his old age, he didn't move fast anymore, but he still carried himself like the lawman he'd always been. Back straight, eyes steady. People on the street, even strangers, could sense it. They might not have known who he was, but they knew he was someone to respect. He kept a few old things from his younger days: a revolver, a faded photograph, and a silver dollar he'd once flipped before a gunfight. Sometimes he'd turn it over in his hand, the metal cool against his skin, and think about all the chances he'd taken and all the men who never got another toss of the coin. Josephine worried about him. He didn't sleep much. Sometimes she'd wake in the night to find him sitting by the window, staring at the moon. She'd whisper, "Wyatt, come back to bed." He'd nod, but keep looking outside a little longer. Maybe he was watching for ghosts. Maybe he was just remembering who he used to be. The world began to take an interest in him again. Hollywood was booming, and the Western was becoming America's favorite story. Young actors and directors came to visit, eager to learn from the man who had lived the tales they wanted to tell. He'd walk with them on dusty film sets, pointing out how gunfighters really stood, how they aimed, how they breathed before drawing. He'd shake his head at their fancy costumes and say quietly, "Real cowboys didn't look that clean." The film people adored him. To them, Wyatt Earp wasn't just a man. He was the living symbol of everything America wanted to believe about itself: bravery, justice, endurance. He'd smile politely but never say much. He knew that what they loved wasn't him, it was the idea of him. One of the last to visit was a young man named John Ford, who listened closely and would later build his own empire of Western legends on the big screen. Another was Tom Mix, the silent film cowboy star. He called Wyatt Mr. Earp and treated him like royalty. Once, Tom asked him if he missed the old days, the saloons, the gunfights, the long rides across the desert. Wyatt thought for a moment, then said, "No, I miss the silence after." That was the truth. For all his fame, Wyatt never cared for noise. He'd lived too long among echoes. In 1928, his health began to fail. The years of travel, loss, and hardship had worn him down. He grew weaker by the day, but still refused to complain. When the doctor told him to rest, Wyatt only said, "I'll rest when I'm done." On January 13, 1929, as the morning light touched the windows of his small Los Angeles home, Wyatt Earp took his final breath. Josephine sat by his side, holding his hand until the end. He was 80 years old, the last gunfighter of the Old West. They cremated his body quietly, without ceremony. There were no bugles, no headlines, no crowds. But when word spread, a few who remembered came to pay their respects. Tom Mix led the procession, tears hidden behind dark glasses. Behind him followed men from the studios, old lawmen and silent faces who understood what had been lost. They laid Wyatt's ashes in a small plot in Colma, California. No one spoke much at the grave. The wind did all the talking. The Old West was gone. And with Wyatt Earp, its last heartbeat faded into history. But the strange thing about legends is, they never really die. They just change shape. They move from the dust to the screen, from the screen to memory, from memory to myth. And somewhere out there, in the desert where he once stood tall, the echo of his boots still lingers, because in every story told about courage, justice, and standing alone, there's a piece of Wyatt Earp, the man who never ran and never quite rested. Time has a way of turning men into memories, and memories into myths. When Wyatt Earp died, the frontier died with him, but his name didn't stay buried. It grew, rising through stories, movies, and the dreams of a nation that still longed for heroes. He became the lawman who never backed down, the man who stood alone in the dust and faced chaos with steady hands. And even though the real Wyatt Earp was far more complicated, people needed to believe in him. In a world that kept changing, Wyatt became the symbol of something that never should. For decades after his death, America kept retelling his story, polishing it, shaping it, and giving it new meaning with every generation. Each version reflected the times. In the dark years of the Great Depression, Wyatt represented hope, proof that one man could bring order to madness. During the 1950s, he stood for moral clarity, the clean, brave sheriff who restored justice to a wild land. By the 1970s and 80s, as America questioned its past, Wyatt became something else. Not a hero, but a man torn between duty and doubt. And yet, through all those retellings, the essence of Wyatt Earp stayed the same. He was the line in the sand, the one that divided what is right from what is easy. He showed that courage isn't about power. It's about choice. Wyatt's story endures because it speaks to something deeply human, the need to believe that even in a world without rules, someone will stand up for what's right. The frontier may have vanished, but the struggle it represented never did. The fight between law and chaos, between honor and greed, between truth and myth, it's still here, just wearing different faces. And in that way, Wyatt Earp never really left. He became the spirit of the Western, the heartbeat of every story where a lone figure rides into town, faces the darkness and brings light, even if it costs him everything. Hollywood turned that image into an icon. John Ford's sweeping landscapes, Clint Eastwood's quiet stare, Kevin Costner's steady walk. All of them echo the shadow of Wyatt Earp. Even when the name changes, the idea stays, a man standing between order and oblivion. But maybe the most powerful part of Wyatt's legacy isn't the legend, it's the lesson. Because if you strip away the gunfights, the silver mines, and the fame, what remains is a man who never gave up on what he believed in. He made mistakes. He broke laws. He hurt people, but he also loved deeply, stood fiercely, and carried the burden of his choices with dignity. That's why his story still matters. Not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. He was proof that even flawed men can rise to greatness when the moment demands it. That doing the right thing doesn't always make you a hero, but it still matters that you do it. In the quiet years of his life, Wyatt never bragged about his past. When people asked about Tombstone, he'd shrug and say, "There's nothing to tell. I was just doing my job." And maybe that's what makes him timeless, because heroes don't call themselves heroes. They just do what's needed and let history decide the rest. Today, Wyatt Earp's story is told in classrooms, museums, and on screens around the world. His gunfights are reenacted, his name engraved on souvenirs, his legend retold to tourists walking the same streets where he once stood. But if you look past the noise, if you listen carefully, you can still feel something real. The faint echo of boots on a wooden boardwalk, the whisper of wind across an empty street, the calm before the shot that changed everything. That's the real Wyatt Earp, not the one in the movies. Not the perfect hero, but the man who stood up when standing up meant standing alone. And maybe that's the reason his story keeps coming back. Because every generation finds itself at its own OK Corral, that moment when doing what's right feels impossible. And every generation needs someone to remind them that courage isn't born from strength. It's born from conviction. If Wyatt could speak today, he might not care much about the fame. He might just tip his hat, give that quiet half-smile, and say something simple. Don't let fear make your choices, because that's the truth of his life. He faced fear, loss, and loneliness, but he never let them rule him. He lived long enough to see himself become legend. And long after he was gone, the legend became something even greater, a mirror reflecting the best and worst of all of us. The world will keep changing. The deserts will keep shifting, but somewhere, in the space between truth and myth, Wyatt Earp will always ride again, steady, silent, and unbroken, because some names don't fade. They echo.